The winners of the Frank Willison Award for her contributions to the Python community. She's a co-author of the Python Cookbook 2nd edition, and she has a degree from Stanford in cognitive science. Please welcome Anna Martelli Ravenscroft.
Hi, everyone. So I realize that it's really late. You guys are probably kind of tired, having worked all day. But we're going to actually start out by making you try and remember things. So we're going to put up a list of words, and I'm going to have you try and remember those words, and there will be a quiz later on. Good thing we've had food here already. Okay, and a list of images that I'd like you to remember, okay? Okay, so remember there will be a quiz later on. Why are we talking about this? How many people here were for Alex's talk on bugs in November? Okay. We kind of mentioned briefly some of the reasons that you have bugs in your programs and things like that. And this is kind of a follow-on talk to that, getting a little more in-depth into why you really can't trust your brain. The important thing to understand about your brain is that it's really lazy. Your brain wants to limit its cognitive load because thinking is hard. It uses a lot of energy. And so it uses heuristics to figure out, what am I looking at? It has very limited attention. I know we all think we're great multitaskers. Well, I know I'm not, but everybody thinks they're great at multitasking. We suck at it. We're terrible at multitaskers. We use each other for social cues of what we're looking at, and we use projection. So let me get into what those things mean. Heuristics, our brains are amazing at pattern completion. That's how we recognize what we're looking at. So we use things like mental models. If we see something that looks like a back button from a web browser, it better act like a back button because our mental model is going to be that that's a back button. So if your app has something that looks like that and isn't a back button, your users are going to be very confused because you're violating their mental models. When we see something with 4 legs, 2 ears, and a tail that's back there waving, we say, hey, that's a dog, because it matches our prototype of what a dog looks like. We use availability. Politicians rely on this. Name recognition. Brands rely on this. When you're at the store, the brand that you've heard a lot about is the one that you're more likely to pick simply because you recognize it as, oh, hey, I know what that thing is. And so you're more likely to pick that brand. You're more likely to vote for that politician. Primacy and recency. Primacy is the first thing on the list. You're going to be more likely to remember. Recency is the more recent that you've heard about something, the more likely you are to remember it. Those are the strongest connections because they're built that way. Confirmation bias, we'll get into what that means. So mental models, this is one of my favorite stories ever, and I did check on Snopes, it's actually true. So this is a letter to the editor. A lot of deer get hit by cars west of Crown Point on US 231. There's too many cars to have the deer crossing here. The deer crossing sign needs to be moved to a road with less traffic. This is a faulty mental model that confused deer crossing with pedestrian crossing and assumes that the deer crossing sign tells the deer this is where you should cross. So, pattern matching. Our brains are great at pattern matching, but that can affect, that is how we make memories, and that's how we do recognition of what we're looking at, how it affects, but it affects our perception and our memories. So we do things like generalizing, we do things like seeing things that aren't there, and we'll show you some of that. We do stereotyping. Which line is larger? Top? Okay, yeah. Because of perspective, in the real world, if you are looking at tracks and that yellow line out there looks the same size as this, it must be larger. So perspective will make you think very likely that it's the same, that one is larger, not that it's the same size. Now, a lot of us are geeks, and so our brains work a little bit different from, neurotypicals, and, we've encountered a lot of these things before as well, but this does happen. How many triangles do you see? Raise your hand. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay. You might see one there. You might see one there. You might see one there. And you might see one over in the Pac-Man things. There are no actual triangles on this board, on this picture, but your brain fills in the gaps. And if you see lots of cute pictures of adorable white puppies, when you see an adorable white puppy behind a brick wall, your brain recognizes that there's an adorable white puppy back there. Of course, it could be wrong. Your mind is reading this automatically without even thinking about it. It's not actually all letters, but because it looks like it, we can do that. Now, our brains work based on expectations. Our perceptions are based on expectations. So, everybody says, oh, I know what I see. Witnesses are terrible. What we see, what we think we see, don't rely on that. So, an example from my own experience, in the US, this is a walk sign. In Italy, it's a walk sign too. In the US, this is the don't walk. In Italy, this is don't walk. Now, to me, that looks like a person, not like a hand. So, when I see this at an intersection, I think I'm seeing this instead of this, and so I walk. And that's dangerous in Italy. It's dangerous enough to walk when the walk sign is on. So we had to buy tickets for a train. And of course, where do you buy tickets for the train? You buy them at the Tabaccaria. Well, I know that the Tabaccaria has a big blue sign with a big blue T. So I saw this, and I would have sworn that that was a Tabaccaria sign, and I headed for that sign. Well, that's not a Tabaccaria sign. This is. But I could have sworn that I saw that because I was expecting to see this. And so Alex had to stop me and direct me to where the real Tabaccaria was so we could buy our train tickets. Okay. How are gas prices right now? Are they really high or really low? I'm hearing mostly lows. Now, if you are a bit older, And remember back when gas first went over $1.50 back in 2000, you might say, well, you know, yeah, it's lower than it was, but it's still crazy high. This is an example of anchoring based on the most recent numbers that you're accustomed to. What they found is that if you give someone numbers, they will anchor on those numbers. And so this is actually, retailers use this. They'll show you first something really, really expensive, and then show you something cheaper. And even though they know that nobody's going to buy this expensive one, because you saw that first, you think that the other one is cheaper and a good price. Stereotyping is a form of pattern matching. It's automatic. We all do it. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. Sorry. However, we also have some negative stereotypes because of the cultures that we grew up in, and those can be overcome. One of the ways of overcoming those is with awareness and thinking about the fact that you've got this negative stereotype, or even a stereotype that you don't think of as negative but might be less useful than it should be. For example, I've got a lot of people who keep trying to take me from programming and put me in customer support or managerial roles because I'm female. And female women are supposed to be nurturing. And that's a stereotype that we have. And I suck at those. I'm terrible at those roles. I don't want those roles. So that, for me, would be a stereotype that is not useful. And being aware that you have those stereotyped reactions, even if you don't want to, is important in order to overcome them. One of the ways of doing that is something called blind auditions. This was created by an orchestra that were really, really invested in increasing the diversity of their orchestra members, but they were finding that they kept hiring the same kind of people. So what they ended up doing was they actually did auditions behind a screen, so they could not see the person that was auditioning. And they found that just by doing that, they increased the number of female and people of color musicians that they were hiring, that they were giving offers to, just because that's automatic stereotyping that they didn't even believe in, but was built into them. They were able to defeat that. So keep that kind of thing in mind when you're hiring, that it happens. We all do it, but we can defeat it. So now it's quiz time. Everybody remember the words? I want you to raise your hand if this word was on the list.
Yes.
Raise your hand if the word was on the list.
No. No.
Okay. So, Andy was the first word on the list. So, primacy. Biscotti was the last word, recency. Cookie was not on the list. Cookies was. Sweet was not on the list. I saw a lot of people going, no. And a couple people actually raised their hands. Now, geeks are often less likely to do this. This is called gist memory. It's a false memory because of semantic generalization. We tend to be less likely to do this, but we still fall for it too. Other forms of false memories are source attribution errors. Where did I park today? And am I sure I'm remembering it as where I parked today versus where I parked yesterday? When I was at Stanford, I had to take a picture of my bicycle before I would go into class, because otherwise I would walk out of there and have no idea where I parked, because I went there every day, and I would be going to somewhere that I parked like last time. We do this in parking lots. You know, wait, I always park there, but I didn't park there this time. And so you can't find your car. Witness statements are terrible because people are very suggestible. If a cop asks, did the car stop at the stop sign? The person will remember a stop sign at that intersection, whether there was one or not. They will remember there being a stop sign at that intersection. So it's really, this is why cops really have to have a lot of training in how to get witness statements, otherwise they can totally screw it up. Another one is, did I really do it, or did I just think real hard about it? Now, I want everyone to look at this tree. Pretty tree, nice and green. Okay, now close your eyes, don't fall asleep, and visualize the tree. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Okay, I want everybody to raise your right hand. Okay, now put it down, close your eyes, and visualize raising your left hand. Okay, now, in your brain, you can open your eyes now. There's a part of your brain which is the visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and that's where you process when you see things. That's the first place that you start processing when you see things. And the same areas that process what you're actually seeing when you were looking at that tree, fire when you were imagining that tree. When you were visualizing that tree, those same areas fired. With the primary motor cortex, the same areas fire when you imagine lifting your left hand as when you actually were raising your hand. It may have been on the other side of it. Athletes use this to actually imagine and visualize their practices, and it actually increases their performance by visualizing their practice as well as physically practicing it. So, why does this matter to us as developers? Did I do it, or did I really think about it really hard? If you're in the middle of doing a bunch of code and you've got boilerplate code, or you've got something where you copied and pasted code and you just have to tweak it here and there, if you get interrupted in the middle of that, you may think that, well, I fixed that because you thought about it real hard, but you may not have actually fixed all of those places. This is one of the reasons Alex keeps talking about DRY, don't repeat yourself. If you've got more than one instance of a bunch of code, that, you know, factor out what's common and make it into, you know, something that you only have to give it different parameters and it'll do what you need to, rather than having multiple places. This is also why I like Python better than, say, Java, because there's less boilerplate. But that's just because I'm not that used. Distractions can also cause you to think you did something, but you didn't. Multitasking, we are terrible at multitasking, really. They've done studies, and the more great at multitasking you think you are, probably the less good at it you really are. So, remember the images? Okay. Did you see this one? How about this one? Okay. Okay. This is the actual list that I showed in the beginning. This one was not in the actual list. As I said, remember, this was in the story about Italy. Okay. This one was also not in the list. This was in the story about the deer crossing. This one, you guys didn't fall for it, but that's good. I had something very like this in Italy with the Italian deer crossing sign, and a bunch of people raised their hands. What could happen for some people, I did see some people go, and then they looked around and nobody else was serving. I know. So that's social cues, we'll get into that. So, have your deer crossing story, and talking about pedestrian crossings. If it was a bit later, say tomorrow, it would not surprise me if you remembered that there was a pedestrian crossing sign in that list because of conflating those two things. Okay. Pick a card, any card. No. The rule is if a card has a vowel, the other side must be an even number. Okay? Everybody get the rule? So you have to turn over a card to find out whether this rule is broken or not. So, and test the rule. Now we all know we have to turn over A and find out if there's an even number on there, because obviously if we turn over A and there's an odd number, the rule is broken. But what other cards do we need to turn over? Okay. How about B? Okay. 4? 7? Okay. If you said 4, which a bunch of you did, it's an example of confirmation bias. We never said that you couldn't have a consonant on the other side of a even number. We're just trying to find out whether every vowel has an even number on the other side. So we have to turn over 7, and someone hollered, to find out whether that is a vowel or a consonant. Because if there's a vowel on the other side, then it would prove the rule wrong. Now, why am I telling you about this? What's this got to do with programming? Not all that uncommon for people to do unit testing and things like that, and test to prove that the program works. And feed it a bunch of data, and yes, it's doing exactly what I expect it to. And forget about some of the edge cases and bad data. What if I feed it the wrong things? What if someone attacks it? Those kinds of things. If you're more experienced, you're more likely to do that sort of thing. But we do this in programming. We also do it in our regular lives. We tend to look for things that prove that we're right. For example, I tend to look for things that prove that Python is the best language out there. Okay, selective attention. I mentioned that attention is a limited resource. You can only really pay attention to one thing at a time. We're really not as good at multitasking as we think. So, if you've seen this before, please don't give it away. Okay? We're going to pull up a video here, and I want you to count how many times the team in white passes the ball. Okay? And like I said, if you've seen this before, don't give it away. Okay. Okay, how many passes did you count? Okay. It was actually 15 passes. you see the gorilla?
Yes. The gorilla was supposed to pull out a banana and shoot something.
Okay. So,
Question.
yes,
Didn't you actually count all of the passes?
it said the team in white.
All of them had white shoes.
They meant the people in white shirts. But white shoes is perfectly fine too. The important thing was, did you see the gorilla? Yeah. And typically in like a psych class, they'll show this and there'll be a room full of people and about half of them did not see the gorilla. So, now, change blindness. It's hard to catch changes when they're not obvious, especially changes over time. And we're really good at noticing movement, things that move, but we're not as good at noticing differences. And we're better at noticing errors when they're next to each other. So, I imagine that some of you may have noticed that there were 2 ats and 2 twos. Probably fewer of you noticed that there were 2 R's because they're not next to each other. Now, in the next set of pictures, they're the same picture with one difference, and I want you to find the difference. And once you see the difference, I want you to raise your hand, but don't say anything, okay? Okay, so you've got some people saw it. Now they're next to each other. Now they're really next to each other. And now it's highlighted with movement, so. Okay, it's a canal. People are looking at the flowers in the canal and things like that. Your eyes aren't up though, they're looking at the window, or lack thereof. We run into this same problem on web pages when you're filling out a form, and there's a problem with how you filled out the form, and you hit submit and nothing happens, and you're like, well, why isn't saying, did it take the submit? Okay, and then you eventually, if I'm on a small screen, I have to actually scroll up and see that there's something up top of the form. My eyes aren't up there saying, oh, you forgot to fill out such and such. Well, my eyes aren't up there. My eyes are down here, where the submit button is. And so, when you're doing things like this, you need to put any important information that the person needs to see down where they're looking. And maybe do something to direct their eye to it. Not flashing, please, or blinking. But something to give them an idea that they should look for it there. Okay, I mentioned social cues. We are humans. We evolved to look to each other for cues on how to interpret our environment. We evolved that way because if she sees a tiger over there in the bushes and I hear rustling and I look at her and she looks afraid and starts running, I better be running too, or the tiger's going to eat me, and I'm not going to reproduce. If I look at her and I hear a rustling and I look at her and I see, oh, she looks perfectly calm, then I'm going to assume that everything's fine and it's just Billy playing in the bushes or something. Now she may be just wanting me to get eaten because I'm competition, but that's a different thing. So we look at each other to figure out, what does this mean? What should I do? How should I interpret what I'm seeing? Look at the dot. Now, if this were a perfectly dark room, which obviously it's not, after a while that dot would start looking like it's moving. It's called the autokinetic effect. And after doing this with people, eventually, they will decide that that dot is moving about 3 centimeters or 5 centimeters, but they'll settle on this is how far it's moving. And, okay, that individual, she's going to have, say, 3 centimeters. Alex over here is going to say 5 centimeters. You pick 9 here, there. Sorry. If we get them all into a group and go around and say, okay, how far is it moving? The estimates are going to start moving toward the group norm. And so everybody says, oh, so she's going to say, well, maybe it's moving 3.5 centimeters. And they'll say, well, maybe it's moving 4.5 centimeters or 4. And everybody will claim that, you know, well, I wasn't influenced by anybody else. But when we get them back in the room alone, that new estimate stays there. So we are affected, our perceptions are affected. Now, I want to talk to you 4 people. You don't. You didn't see that. Okay, so which one matches the one on the left?
Hey.
Okay. How about now?
C. C.
Okay. Now, obviously, we all know that he's giving the right answer. But if we did this experiment and we had 4 or more people, chances, and we kept doing it, chances are that there would, over time, someone would cave and give incorrect answers on 32% of the trials. And 75% of people cave at least once. Okay?
32% invariant of the number of answers, or at close to it?
What's that?
Is the 32% invariant of the number of answers, or at close to it?
No, they were very obvious differences, like we have here. So it wasn't where it was close in, you know, well, it could have been this or that. There were obvious differences. But because they were surrounded by other people giving these wrong, and they're my Confederates, so I already told them what to say. Thank you guys, and thank you. But because normally he wouldn't know that I had already timed them. And so he'd just be thinking these people are giving weird answers, but okay, well, maybe there's a reason and I'll go along with it. There's factors that affect how likely it is that he's going to go along with it. If there's 4 or more people, it's more likely. If it's anonymous, it's less likely. If he gets to write his answer, doesn't matter what they say. And if there's one dissenter, any one of you guys over there had said, I don't care what she said, the answer is C, then he would have felt perfectly okay in saying the answer is C. Bystander effect. How many people have heard of the bystander effect? Okay. It comes from a case back in, I think, the 70s where a woman was murdered in an apartment complex. People saw it, and no one actually did anything. No one went and called the cops. Nobody did anything. They saw each other standing there watching too. And the problem is that people base their behavior on what other people around them are doing. And they don't realize that they're doing it. So, there was another experiment. I'm I like the experiments because they're fun to do things to people. The smoke-filled room. So you get a person in a room and start filling it with smoke, and the person says, well, something's wrong here, and goes and tells the experimenter, right? But if you got 3 or more people in that room, then it's less likely that that individual is going to go tell anybody. Yeah, I know, yeah, I'll fix that in a second. But part of it is diffusion of responsibility, that someone else will tell me that there's something wrong with the screen. But also, others' behavior is a cue. And we look to each other to decide whether this is a problem. Now let me go fix this. I've been talking a whole hour. Wow. All right. Okay. So, we work together in teams. We get together and do things like brainstorming. What should our next feature be? What should we do about this? Should we do our architecture thing? We have sessions where we discuss how we're going to do things. And it's really easy to converge too early on an answer because of social cue, because we are involved to kind of converge on an answer together. So, ways to defeat that is have participants think about the problem and write down ideas first before anybody says anything, or even before you come to the meeting. And go around the room and hear all ideas before you get to do any kind of springboarding off of someone else's idea. Another thing is diversity. The less like you that another person looks, or the less like you that they talk, the more likely it is that you're going to stop thinking that they think the same way that you do, and the more likely it is that they'll come up with something very different because of different perspectives from you, and so it helps to avoid the group thing. So, projection. I mentioned projection. We have something called a false consensus effect. We think that, what would these guys think about this? Well, what do I think about this? And then project what I think about it onto them. So what do I know about this app? And I project that onto my users. And it's really easy to do that and think that you know the user's needs, the user's perspectives, and the user doesn't think anything like you. And the more different the user is from you, the less likely they are to think like you or to even perceive things like you. They're not going to see stuff the same way you do. You are not the user. They have different mental models. They have different perceptions. And so it's really important that you keep that in mind and have actual users involved with your apps, with your projects, because you are not the user. I don't care how good of a programmer you are, or developer, or HCI person, whatever, you're not the user. So let's talk a little bit about a couple things you can do based on having gone through an hour of me blathering about this. How do you avoid bugs and letting this stuff trip you up? Pair programming and code reviews. Alex talks about that all the time. And they're really good for helping you see those typos, but also for catching the mental models that you might not have realized you have in mind. They might say, wait, what were you thinking here? And have you actually document that so that other people who are coming in to maintain it later will have a better idea of what you have in mind here. Don't rely on your memory. Your memory sucks. all of our memory sucks. And that's what bug trackers and version control systems are for. Especially if you're wondering, did I make that change? Maybe you did, or maybe you thought about it real hard. DRY, as Alex mentioned last time, avoid repetitive and boilerplate code. Don't repeat yourself, unless you're giving a talk. Write and automate tests. Don't prove that it works, try to break it. You know, we know this, but we tend to fall into the, I proved it worked, mindset easily without thinking about it. Document your code and your change list. Don't assume that the maintainer will get why you did something that way, even if it's you as the maintainer in 6 months. And use diversity to reduce groupthink and increase the alternative perspectives. And put important information where the user is currently looking, or direct their eye there. And please have real users do their user testing, which means releasing early and often, but most important, don't trust your brain. We're done. We get to look at the black hole for a while. Questions? Answers? You want to go home? Yes?
I have a question. You were talking about diversity.
Yes.
Were you suggesting that if I'm in a diverse group, that because I perceive someone else as different than me, that I'm going to listen to them differently?
Yes. Shallow diversity,
whether
the visual aspects of diversity, or them having an accent or something perceptually different, will make you listen to them differently, and you will have different expectations of what you're going to hear from them, and you're less likely to project that, well, they'll think the same way about this that I do. And so you'll more likely take that extra instant to get their opinion on it before moving straight into the converging of opinions.
So part of the value of the diversity is not so much that they are different, but that I expect them to be different.
Yes. Yeah, it is. Which makes it really important that when you're talking about diversity, which I have other talks all about that, that you keep in mind that diversity isn't just those surface characteristics, but that you hire people who are actually have different perspectives beyond that. You don't just hire everybody from the same university program in computer science, because they're all going to have the same perspective because it was trained into them. If you hire people from a variety of places, and you hire people from a variety of disciplines, as well as the surface diversity that everybody talks about, it will give you actually, you'll have better projects. There's been a lot of research on that just because of the different perspectives that they have, the different ways that they have of explaining things, the different analogies that they use, and also the different needs that they have. They'll notice things, needs that are out there that you might not even notice. And you'll notice things that they don't. And so that's why it's important to have those different kinds of diversity, not just the surface aspects, but don't ignore the surface aspects as part of leveraging diversity to make your projects better.
But I was actually wondering, so how can I fool myself to believe that I'm in a much more diverse group than I actually am?
Hire some different people, or add some people to your team that are very different from you.
Well, but I'm just wondering if it's partly my perception, so how could I actually take that insight?
Part of it is doing things like I mentioned, where instead of, you know, the brainstorming, like everybody gets in a room and somebody starts off, and then usually it's the same loud people, and one of them. And everybody, you know, by the time the third person has spoken, everybody's converging and springboarding off of that, and you haven't heard what the other three people are saying. And so some of these ideas that I gave about having people write it down first, and I see a hand up looking like you have answers.
I would suggest that if you're trying to see the diversity in your group, just ask them what their approach to testing is, and you'll realize how diverse a group you actually have.
Okay.
Yeah, so with regard to diversity, there are different contexts. There's different PayPal guys. David Sachs of PayPal is notorious for claiming that diversity actually hurts the ability of words to achieve harmony. Cites the examples of the PayPal app. What's your opinion on that?
Okay. Diversity is a different talk, but there are tensions within when you're dealing with diversity, simply because there are a bunch of different kinds of people, and they have different perspectives, and they have different ways of approaching problems and different ways of interacting. And so you need a really strong management, you need really strong commitment, you need education, you need, it's harder to do, but it gives you much better results if you take that time and commitment and work to do it. But if you want to get into that, I'll give a different talk some other time, which is all about diversity and leveraging it. Yes, ma'am?
I was wondering, is the part of the brain that records images different from the part of the brain that records words? And my second question is it actually easier to, can you recognize images faster than words?
Could you repeat the question?
There's some debate as to whether images and words are recorded in different parts of the brain. There's some indication that it is, but it's, which was the question, but it's, I haven't seen the latest on what they've actually found. There's some research that shows that Jennifer Aniston has their own, you know, actual neuron recording pictures of her. I've seen the research, and that your grandmother has her very own neuron in your head. So where things are recorded and exactly how is a really hot topic right now. And what was your second?
The second one was, do people in general recognize images faster than words, or the other way around?
Depends on the people.
Because there seems to be a favoring of, you know, icons and images for interfaces.
It can be easier to recognize images in general, but some of those icons are not well, not the best thought out, and so I have trouble with some of the icons. So it varies. For me, an icon, unless I've seen it repeatedly, it's like, this is where you get into the mental models, because this is an icon for what? I have no clue. And so being able, it's important to be able to get the words with it, to the label for it, to find out what the heck were they thinking? So, and also you have people who have disabilities, visual disabilities, and they have to have the words simply because their screen reader is what they would use to be able to interact.
So, I loved your speech, by the way. It was great. So in regards to this following the consensus and the errors you get from it, so if we look at the likes and the most viewed and most visited, it's, I guess the idea from the beginning was to find quality content and things that's the best But apparently it's a bit broken, so do you have any alternative models that might work better?
I have not thought about that. I'll get back to you if I
Thank you.
think of it. But, you know, it's certainly more popular at the moment. But, yeah, it doesn't necessarily make it the best. It's simply the thing that catches our eyes the most. So, there was somebody over here.
I have a question.
And then you.
And a question on the experiment you did then.
Yeah.
The social cue doesn't depend on the nature or the objective nature of the comparison. In this case, what you used, the answer was pretty obvious and measurable.
Yeah.
Would it still hold? The person would still actually take the cue and guess it correctly when it's so obvious?
No, this is from the actual paper. From the actual experiment. These pictures. And yes, they were that obvious.
There's no subjectivity really. It's very obvious.
Yeah, it's very, when individuals did it on their own, they got the right answer 100% of the time. It was very obvious. So, yeah, it wasn't where it was, well, maybe it's that one or that one. No. No, it was that distinct.
And these were average people.
Yeah, these were just average, well, it was probably psych students getting credit for their course, which is where most psychology experiments are done. But it's been redone enough that it's probably generalizing it both to the most other, you know. It's kind of like economists use economist students for, you know, all of their testing. So, yeah, I think he was next. Then you.
I had a comment from your end.
Okay, go ahead.
So, just a comment on this. I, like her, joke about the fact that most of our behavioral research teaches us how undergrads behave, not how people behave. And there's actually one important case, okay, not in programming, it's in economics. So, the disposition effect, strongly confirmed in experiments, shows that you value what you have more than what you don't have. You have a cognitive bias that makes something that's yours more valuable in your perception. So, an economist said, so how did commerce and trade and bargain and barter ever happen? And he actually did the research on people who, possibly as a hobby, but with a lot of money involved, or even make a living from trading sports cars. And showed that the guys walking into the trade fair show the disposition effect like totally. They get a card, then swapping it for another won't happen because they value too much. People with years of experience trading lose the disposition effect totally. That is, something that gets lost in all of this research is humans learn. Surprise. That's why somebody with 10 years experience, even though they may not be so brilliant as a young guy just out of university, can actually outperform on the job pretty often because they've learned for 10 years. Now, of course, the trick is finding out the guy who has actually spent 10 years as opposed to 1 year, 10 times. But that's a different sorry. But I thought that was very important to observe.
For example, someone who's experienced as a developer is less likely to test that it works and more likely to try to break it. So, you had a question.
I'm not sure I follow the bystander effect and coding. How does that play together?
Which one?
Bystander effect that you mentioned.
The bystander effect has to do with when you're talking about people getting together and doing stuff in a group. If you're working together in a group, you're less likely, face to face, you're less likely to have people. Well, with geeks, it's all bets are off. Because we're the kind of people who always, you know, hey, there's that typo right there. But, you know, when you've got say user testing, your users may not want to say something because they don't want to rock the boat. So if you've got user testing, you need to make, and they don't want to hurt your feelings. So if you're doing user testing in groups, it might be even more likely that they're, so, you know, you need to be careful when you're dealing with the people that they actually know that, yes, you really are supposed to speak up. Yes.
Do you think that might explain why there's still pro programmers in the world?
Okay.
Shot.
Nice shot. All right, back up.
Can I use groupthink in production to maybe board an agenda I had at the meeting, or like get a bunch of people together to go to the restaurant I want, or
Why not? Advertisers do it all
Please
the time.
repeat the question for those of us
He wants to know if he can use groupthink to get what he wants. And yes, advertisers do it all the time.
It's called marketing, yeah.
Marketing.
imagine like, let's say like I'm in a design meeting and I'm pushing for like this thing, or I want to like redo our entire infrastructure with this other thing, like
Get some Confederates, you know, set up ahead of time, and you know you can own the meeting.
make sure they don't write anything down beforehand.
Yeah.
That's lobbying.
Yeah, lobbyists, marketers, yeah.
You've talked about
Salespeople.
You've talked about different languages, and I'm curious how much work in cognitive psychology has actually been done to compare different languages, and to, for instance, to do the work to see whether or not there's a difference in the error rates between, say, Python and Perl.
That I have heard that there has been some. I know that pair programming they've done some work with. I don't know how much they've done with actual computer languages, programming languages. I would have to check on it.
But it seems like such a natural thing.
Yeah, it does.
If you're especially if you're teaching language design, computer science, that there's a natural
Is this an answer?
cross-dimensional or cross-disciplinary connection there.
Seems like it would be a really good research project for someone. Yeah.
So I want to play devil's advocate and challenge peer review with consensus thinking. So if I know something has been peer reviewed, am I less likely to challenge it if I see an obvious mistake because it has been peer reviewed? Or is the peer review more important because I know this will be reviewed, so you know, it's more important beforehand?
Peer review is actually a really interesting situation. Peer review is, there's been a lot of work from sociologists on the topic for some time because there's a whole lot more of groupthink and people being willing to follow the crowd and things like that than they like to admit. And so while it may make you less likely to challenge, which was your question, or make you less likely to challenge, it shouldn't, because it is, there are some problems with it that they've been discovering. And for example, what was the, there was an economics paper that was like the big thing. It was peer reviewed over countries and how their economy was affected by the GDP versus their deficit.
Reinhold and Rogoff proved and got peer reviewed and not applauded just by other economists, but all the conservative politicians all over the world jumped over it, that if public debt goes over 90% GDP, growth disappears and it's total crisis forever. And a student who couldn't really get the result asked them to please get their spreadsheets. Turns out they had a bug in their spreadsheet and there is no such effect.
Yeah. And so,
I was kind of perplexed because I know that when Britain was about to become the superpower in the world, 1815, their public debt was to 180% of GDP. So that just couldn't work. It was impossible. They hadn't, of course, gone back that far, so those data were simply absent.
But people,
But the peer reviewers didn't look at the numbers. They didn't, much less did they debug their spreadsheets.
So, and the peer reviewers are, everybody says, oh, well, it's peer reviewed, so it must be good. And so they're less likely to challenge unless you're some, student who's trying to...
And Reinhold and Reinhardt are famous authors, so their book, This Time is Different, is a bestseller, both academic and popular.
You had your hand.
Back to diversity.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's fine.
I think human beings are pack animals in a way.
Yes.
Because we follow like minds and we make relationships with people with like minds, and
yes, we
they're very much like that. So diversity almost goes against, in a way, our natural inclination to find somebody that programs the way we do, think the way we do, wants to take testing the way we do, everything. So how do you, what do you recommend? I know maturity has a lot to do with that. I think that helps. But how do you fight against your natural inclinations when you're trying to sum up the person and see, the interview process, or how do you fit in, or even? Because I've been on both sides of that fence.
Oh yeah. Idealism helps. So you don't have to necessarily be mature. Education helps, awareness helps, and also looking at the actual data as far as how projects, how effective our projects are, and how much diversity does actually help, can help convince you. And then there's a lot of tricks out there to help you overcome your stereotyping and things like that to hire good people. So, but that's a different topic. So, and we've got people over here. I don't want to lose them. So, I think who had their hand up long? Okay.
I have a comment on your joint programming and the groupthink. From what I have noticed, if two people are sitting next to each other and trying to do the same thing, they both see the same thing and the same mistake is done.
Yes, this is why pair programming is not a substitute for code review. The code review needs to be done by a fresh pair of eyes who will catch that. So, yes, I agree.
Okay.
Exactly.
Have you come across any methods or other suggestions on how to keep from falling into groupthink when doing a code review?
You're doing code reviews in groups?
No, I mean,
okay.
just saying, oh yeah, this code was good, instead of thinking, is this really the best way?
Okay. Keep in mind that even experts make mistakes, and there's bugs in everybody's code. Everybody has lapses of attention. Everybody has, problems with all of these things that we saw, and so you're helping them by catching the things that they missed, just because they're human and their brains, maybe they were, thinking about leaving early, or maybe thinking about dinner or lunch or something like that, and missed something. And so you're performing a service for them to make sure that, you're that fresh pair of eyes. So it doesn't matter who it is, it can be the, 30 years expert in the group. If you don't understand their code, or if it doesn't make sense for some reason, or there's something that you see and you're like, wait, what? Challenge them on it. Because just because they're the expert doesn't mean they're going to be the maintainer, and in fact they're probably not, and then that poor person 6 months down the road is having to maintain this is going to go, wait, what? So even if it's not a bug, if it's something that's unclear, you as a code reviewer can really help to make sure that that gets commented, documented, so that the person can maintain it, someone can maintain it later.
What about code smells? called code smells, which is more of an intuitive thing.
Again, if there's a code smell, point it out and say, hey, you know, what's going on here, and try and find out what is causing that for you. And talk to them, you know, and say, hey, you know, there's a problem here. Can you explain why you did it this way?
I found that a lot of people seem to trust common sense much more than they trust empiricism. I actually had the argument with coworkers saying that pounding on the arrow keys is actually slower than using a mouse, and they wouldn't believe me even when I showed them the data. How do you win people over that, you know?
Sometimes you can't.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a fight that's not worth fighting. Sometimes you need to provide both methods, because not everyone can even use the mouse.
Well, that was just an example.
But,
they
yeah.
trust what their intuition says as opposed to what the actual reality says.
The other thing is if it's something where it can be A/B tested, go A/B test it. Get users doing it one way and the other in your prototype, and find out what actually works better for them. So.
I found that everything that seems intuitively correct is usually wrong. So there's always a push to make something more intuitive and whatnot.
Yeah.
I think your intuition on that is actually wrong.
Yeah, but keep in mind, you are not the user, neither are they. So make sure you actually test it with real users, because real users are very different. They think differently than you do. I've worked for a long time in corporate America where the big question was, Anna, why can't I log in? Is your caps lock key on? Oh, you're so smart. They don't have the perspective that you do. They don't have the background in it, and they're going to not see things that you see.
But nowadays, systems are starting to alert you.
Yes,
like,
which is
flash,
great.
your caps lock is on.
Which is great. They don't, it'll actually, and this is an example of actually listening to your users and having them say, having the system actually tell you where you're looking, the caps lock is on. Oh, maybe I don't want the caps lock on. I don't know why the caps lock still exists personally, but yeah.
You mentioned early on that don't put something flashing on the screen. Is there some deep reason for that?
Yes, it hurts.
Epilepsy.
I'm completely serious. Well, you can do it in a way that won't cause epilepsy, but seriously, I have every flash blocker and blocker that I can find for my browsers, because things flashing, anything moving on my screen means that I cannot use that page for what I really want to do. I can't actually see anything else because I can't drain my attention away from the thing that I'm trying to actually read here. Now, if you have a single blink or something to get their attention that, oh, hey, they missed this field that they have to fill in on the form, that's one thing.
But I thought you were talking about cognitive loading and distraction.
Right.
But I thought here the point is to draw attention.
Yes, if it's a form and an occasional hello over here, this is what you have to pay attention to, fine. But the problem is that things tend to get so overloaded with moving and that I can't even see what I'm trying to read here. So yeah, that was why I said be careful of the blinking. Unless it's like the only thing they should be looking at that screen. But also keep in mind that if they're using a screen reader or something, that cannot be your only way of getting their attention there. So, yeah.
The last question.
Yeah, I think we need to do last question. There. Thank you.
Actually, my last question is observation over the last 2 decades, some people start changing from pen and paper to now everybody is using a pen or something to write and do. So the user's habit is actually being changed gradually.
Yeah.
And the introduction of that is just whatever a habit. People say, oh, an old habit will die. Actually, you can build new habits.
Yeah, it's hard to simply remove a habit, but it's a lot easier to build a new habit, to create a new habit in its place. You're right. So, and on that note, thank you, everyone. Just remember, don't trust your brain.